practical applications of impact-weighted accounts. My name is Maddie. I am a researcher with Socious, and I also want to introduce Sarah, who's with us, who is the founder and CEO of Socious. Hi, Sarah.
Hi everyone.
We also have with us a special guest today, Mr. David Freiberg. We will hear a bit more about his experience with impact-weighted accounts in a minute. To get us set up, I just want to give a little bit of context for the conversation that we're about to delve into. As you may have known from the first session that we did, this conversation is arising from how companies are beginning to quantify and monetize the social and environmental impact that they have on the world. Now, of course, we've seen a huge decline in global poverty in the last 200 years. And still, we're facing massive challenges in terms of the environmental impact, the social welfare landscape, and also how products are impacting us and how we're using them. To that degree, Socious is an impact and talent marketplace that connects impact-driven organizations with individuals who are keen on making a positive social and environmental impact. So this brings us to invite our guest speaker, David Freiberg-san. David Freiberg is a senior manager at EY, advisor to Glynn Impact Capital, and a research fellow at Doshisha University. He is frequently a guest lecturer on ESG accounting at Waseda University in Japan, and was formerly the ESG program development manager at Paul Weiss. With an extensive background in accounting, sustainability, and impact measurement, Freiberg-san is a leading thinker in the space of impact-weighted accounting. Welcome, David. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you to share more about your experience.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Sarah, and a big thank you to Socious for the opportunity to speak today. It's really my pleasure to be joining the conversation. I know that last week you had a discussion with some folks at the IFVI, the International Foundation for Valuing Impact, and they introduced impact-weighted accounting and talked a little bit about some of the research and some of the core concepts behind impact accounting. I think today I'd like to jump in a little bit into the practical side of things. How do we actually make impact accounting real, and how do we implement it in the real in our daily business lives? A little bit of kind of my background. I was one of the founding members of the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative back when this was a Harvard Business School initiative before it's spun out to the global IFVI initiative that it is currently. And a lot of our work focused around developing the methodology, which is something that the IFEI team is continuing to work on. One of the things that I realized and became interesting to me is, how do we take these academic learnings and make them something that business leaders, regardless of what part of the organization you sit, can actually use as a tool to make better, more effective business decisions? Really, how do we take these really interesting, novel concepts and say, okay, what do they mean in real life? And I think that's a critical question now, especially with all the questions around what does corporate sustainability look like right now? What does ESG look like? In the US, we have kind of a challenging ESG space between both kind of political pressures as well as impending new disclosure requirements. Similarly, in the EU, we have a lot of questions around what the disclosure framework will look like. And many organizations have spent tons of money and tons of effort preparing for their CSRD and SFDR disclosures. Other regimes across the world are beginning to also implement mandatory disclosures. But there's a big question around, are the ESG disclosures actually addressing the questions we really want? Are we actually improving the outcomes that we need to? On the environmental side, we aren't really seeing it. And on the social side, we're still seeing challenges between how businesses are operating and how they're managing the relationship with employees, as well as local communities and society as a whole. I like to step back and look to see, actually, can we look at the data and say, how are investors, what questions are investors asking companies right now around the information they want from a sustainability perspective? The good news is that the overwhelming majority of investors are still saying we want companies to make meaningful ESG investments into long-term value creation propositions. But at the same time, we're seeing investors say that, well, companies are failing to articulate how their sustainability initiatives connect to value creation, and also that companies are being highly selective in the information that they are providing. And a whopping 94% of investors surveyed, institutional investors surveyed, I should say as well, really believe that there are significant levels of unsupported claims within sustainability disclosures. How do we take this? The way I interpret this is that the reality is that there's a demand for real transparency around what effective disclosures look like. And what I'd like to talk to you about is how impact-weighted accounting can both be a measurement tool for disclosing better sustainability information, but also a tool for assessing how organizations are effectively managing their sustainability issues. Next slide, please, Maddie. And we'll do that by looking through a couple case studies here. And these are all organizations that have publicly disclosed impact-weighted accounting and are at various stages of their impact-weighted accounting journey. The first organization is Eisai Pharmaceutical, a Japanese pharmaceutical company that has been a leading sustainability company for many, many years. About a decade or so ago, Eisai adopted this idea of human healthcare as a core component of their business strategy, and spent a lot of effort both in developing their human capital stock, but also saying if we're going to create financial value through having a social impact. This is an employment impact weighted account that Eisai created, and I think we might have last week discussed a little bit of some of the components of employment impact. Eisai, as I mentioned, spent a lot of time and effort building their human capital practices, and wanted to address an important question. Is this creating financial value for the firm? And is this having a meaningful impact on the key stakeholders we're trying to affect? They answered the first question by using a new model called the PBR model, or the Yanagi model, known in Japan, where they were actually able to quantify how their human capital performance had actually led to an increase in market price. But they also wanted to understand more deeply can they actually quantify the value that is being created to external stakeholders. And they used an employment impact weighted account to be able to identify that, and fundamentally be able to find that roughly they were creating 43% or 44%, rounding up, of their earnings as a factor of employment impact. Next slide, please. Another early adopter of impact-weighted accountings is Acciona, a leading sustainability firm in Spain, infrastructure and renewable energy. And they developed this impact-weighted accounting, showing a variety of different environmental as well as social impact contributors relative to their net profits. And what they did is they used the impact KPIs that they identified through their impact-weighted accounting to actually build a new way of assessing the impact of potential CapEx decision-making going forward, as well as expanding their already quite robust sustainability disclosures. However, one of the challenges that when I look at a disclosure like this, and it's a great work, but how do they actually calculate some of these values? And despite saying that they're integrating impact-weighted accounting into CapEx decisions, how specifically? What really is changing from a governance perspective around the information that's being collected, how management is assessing it, how is the board reviewing it, and how specifically is it fundamentally changing decisions within the firm. Key questions for really how investors are now looking at impact-weighted accounting. Next slide, please. And so the question fundamentally becomes, can we address those two components that Azai tried to, we discussed earlier? One, are sustainability initiatives creating financial value? Two, are they creating meaningful value for the stakeholders that we're addressing with the sustainability initiatives? Summa Equity is a private equity company in the Nordics and has been, I think, one of the leading impact-weighted accounts companies. Summa Equity's value proposition is if they can identify companies that are addressing proactively and effectively the UN SDGs, but in a way that's profitable, they can almost future-proof their business and as well as future sales by saying, well, the SDGs are something that we globally agree that we have to address, and we've created a business solution. There must be a market. And we're able to tie sustainability into financial performance as such. But what they wanted to do is to be able to say, okay, well, how can we actually truly meaningfully show that we're having this impact on these SDGs that we are expecting? Can we quantify the impact that we're having on society? And they turn to impact-weighted accounting to be able to do that. This is an example of an impact-weighted accounting product impact assessment that was done on one of Summa Equity's portfolio companies, Millerex, which is a salmon production company. And on the left here, you can see the calculations that they did to reach their the effectiveness impact, which is really in this case how it's really kind of actually, well, this case is really looking at reduction in cardiovascular diseases. I don't want to get into all the details of how they calculated this, but it's quite straightforward. You can see it's really what they fundamentally did is said, can we find research that looks at the relationship between omega-3 fatty acids in salmon, as well as other fish products, and health outcomes? And we're able to create a fairly simple calculation that was able to show significant impact. Next slide, please. Another example of Summa Equity looking at their portfolio companies is a company called Pajero. One of the conversations that I have with organizations, particularly those that are within the value chain of other companies, i.e. kind of B2B companies, is can we measure impact in the B2B space? Because it's a lot easier to say, okay, what's the impact of a consumer good product, of something that I'm buying from the store? It's easier to kind of conceptually think about impact when we're actually using the end product. And yes, it is a little easier perhaps, but it's definitely not impossible to measure impact from a B2B company. And Pajero is a great example of this. Fundamentally, Pajero looks at, or one of the things they look at is VAT compliance. Fundamentally, efficiency. Are we creating efficiencies within a value chain? And again, you can see on the left, very simple calculations, but it's important to think of, I think this defines a key element of how we can think about impact, how companies can start thinking about identifying their impact. First, who's the stakeholder? Impacts are always tied to specific stakeholders here. And in this case, they're looking at the impacts broadly to society, but also how are they affecting and interacting with other companies? And so not every impact has to be about saving lives or improving health. I think about impact as an efficiency, which can be an impact on your direct suppliers, is a great way of kind of changing the dynamic for how we think about impact. Next slide, please. So what Summa did really, really well is tied impact with financial value creation. And one thing they were able to do is to actually show that, to be able to show this quantitatively. And the outcome for the business was actually that they've been very successful in communicating this and using this as a tool for potential buyers of portfolio companies, increasing multiples upon exit. What this outlines is that impact-weighted accounting, again, is a tool. It's a tool for making better business decisions, but also more fundamentally, communicating the long-term growth proposition of the firm. This is a diagram from Asahi Brewing, which I think is really interesting. And despite the fact it's quite complex and quite messy, many arrows going in many different directions, it fundamentally outlines how Asahi is going from their core material themes, specific initiatives, and a variety of steps along the way, and connecting to their end goal, which is enhancing corporate value. When I have conversations with companies that are very interested in impact-weighted accounting and want to know where to start, the first question I ask them is often, well, what's the goal? What does success look like? Because if you can't define success, we don't know what to measure. And if we can define success, we can build an impact-weighted account around that impact KPI that is fundamentally defining our success state. That's fine. But where we've seen organizations maybe have less success with impact-weighted accounting is when they just focus on that definition of success and they don't say, okay, well, how are we going to get there? What does the steps look like? Many of these impact objectives take a long time to manifest, especially if we're looking at health outcomes or having significant, looking at kind of important social challenges. It might take 5 or even 10 years to really achieve our success state. So what are the interim impact KPIs that we have to build? And how can we use those as indicators for the value that we're creating along this journey? And I think Asahi's done a great job here at doing that. And they're actually building out currently a impact-weighted accounting looking at their responsible drinking objectives, which kind of will turn some of these dotted lines, which are hypothesized paths, into solid dark lines, which are kind of connections that have been proven. So in this case, impact-weighted accounting is a vehicle for actually proving and validating the hypothesis that organizations are developing around their long-term value creation proposition. Next slide, please. I think another great example of an organization that has thought about this vision of kind of what impact-weighted accounting does for your value creation story is, again, ASI. The first ASI case study looked at employment impact-weighted accounting, and this really focused on measurement. We then did a follow-up project with them where we said, okay, let's actually look at a initiative that we've been working on for the last 10 years. And this is a global health project that ASI has been doing in partnership with the World Health Organization. They've been working with the World Health Organization to treat and eradicate lymphatic filariasis, which is a neglected tropical disease. ASI, in partnership with other pharmaceutical companies globally, provide treatments for this disease at free of cost. And the former CFO of ASI, a good friend of mine, pretty much would always have to have conversations with analysts around, well, is this just a donation? This is just just throwing away investor money. And to him, it was, no, this is investment. This is investment. This is about building brand. This is actually a financially viable decision. And we wanted to prove that. And we were able to prove that from the financial perspective. ASI was able to actually build this, they were able to produce these tablets by developing a new plant in India, and which led to upskilling and has since been able to shift other production there. So it's actually financially viable. But we also wanted to be able to show, okay, let's actually quantify the impact that's being created, because we're currently not being recognized for that. Because this is really our proposition about kind of building future markets, but building a brand. And I won't go through all the details of this, but we were able to identify that really that ASI was having about, I think about 6 trillion yen of impact across the lifetime of individuals, both at risk and currently inflicted with lymphatic filariasis. And I think this summarizes the key objective when it comes to impact weight accounting, and really what I've seen as where organizations that are able to use impact weight accounting successfully, and those that maybe just use it as a measurement exercise, and it kind of states that. The first is, what is success? Both in the case of what are you intending to use impact weight accounting for, but also what is the business challenges you're facing? Many organizations will turn to me and say, okay, well, how are investors going to think about impact weight accounting? Is this something that's going to be regulated on in the near future? And we can discuss that later in some questions and answers. And to be honest, I don't know exactly how all investors are going to respond to impact weight accounting if every company did it tomorrow. I don't know. I'm sure many would be very interested, and I actually know many would be very interested. I'm sure some wouldn't care. So I tell organizations often, best case scenario, everyone loves it. Great. The worst case scenario is you've developed a strategy around measuring, assessing, and tracking performance on topics you've already likely disclosed to the public as important for your business. Most major companies have already disclosed material sustainability topics and have a variety of initiatives about them. What are you doing about them? How are they creating value? How are you actually tracking progress and reporting on that? Because these are the questions that investors are starting to ask. And so defining success, where you want to go, but also building that internal management strategy so that you can use impact accounting to both define that success, but also define success as we are moving along that pathway. And with that, Maddie, I'll turn it back to you and we can open up some questions.
Thank you so much. I know I learned a lot and I have several questions, but I want to offer it up to anyone who's listening on X or on YouTube. Sarah, will you help us with that portion? Are there any questions
I
that we
think
can
you
field
should
first?
start with your questions
My
first.
questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So a few here. I'm curious about the last part that you just touched on in terms of the perception of investors and maybe by extension, the management teams of these companies that are considering impact weighted accounting. Of course, it looks great if a company can go through the process of assessing their impact through impact weighted accounting and come up with something that they then show to the public and in some sense sort of validates or verifies their impact so that it's not greenwashing. What happens if they go through that process and they find that actually perhaps there's some activity that's negatively impacting any one of the 3 areas or more that you named? Have you seen that happen, and what has been the response?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the reality is all companies are having negative impacts. They're having positive impacts as well. That's why we're actually, I think, seeing less companies delve into the environmental impact side of things, because environmental impacts are going to be, by definition, heavily negative. It's just somewhat of the nature of how we interact with the world. And understandably, most organizations aren't super excited about disclosing their negative impacts. The reality is that investors already know. that you're having a negative impact. For example, I've had conversations with cement companies before. They know that they have a large negative impact on society, or excuse me, on the environment. They know that. Their investors know that. Everyone knows that. It's not like it's a secret. But they also understand that they're not just this negative impact is the input to having a large social impact. Again, using the example of cement companies, they fundamentally are kind of the building blocks of the world, for lack of a better term. The question then becomes, how do we balance these? And it's a challenging topic, especially when large negative impacts are in play. But being able to show two things, I think, is critical. One, that the interrelationship between the negative and positive impacts. This is not to say that positive impacts kind of negate negative impacts. That's just not the reality. But we want to understand that connection. And the second is, well, what are you doing to mitigate that negative impact while still enhancing that positive impact? I think I've had a lot of conversations with some of the leading sustainability, impact, ESG investors kind of across that gambit. And one of the themes that keeps coming out is that investors know that most companies aren't exactly where they want to be. They understand that the journey you're on a journey. I think a lot of companies are really scared to say and let on any indication that things aren't perfect. And I'm not saying that you need to disclose everything, but disclosing the vision, where you want to get to and why, is really a powerful tool for engaging investors, because especially those that want to invest with you based off of your long-term proposition. And negative impacts can be part of that. Now, organizations that go through impact-weighted accounting and exercise and identify that, okay, well, we actually have some large negative impacts here. My recommendation, my advice is build a plan about that. Build a strategy to address that. Start showing some meaningful progress, and then maybe disclose. You don't need to disclose everything before you kind of have your house in order.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Sarah, am I able to ask one or two more before we switch over? Great. Okay, if I am able to, I want to go back to this slide where you talked about the Asahi case study. So, in trying to understand how another company might take this as inspiration, could you break down a little bit what's happening here? I know you talked about it sort of at big picture, but how do we go from theme all the way to the financial and corporate value? And having been a part of that process, what was that like working with the team?
Yeah, so I didn't work specifically with Asahi on
Okay.
this, so I can't talk about their specific like how they did that in their own thinking. But how other organizations are approaching this is that the kind of the left two columns, I would say. Well, the left columns on identifying themes. I think a lot of companies have already done that. There's a lot of connection between this and kind of the next evolution of the ESG materiality assessment that I think most organizations are quite familiar with at this point. That next box around identifying initiatives, it gets a little bit more challenging, but at the end of the day, most, especially large organizations, have a long list of initiatives. Um, Either some that they are legacy that have been continuing for years, and some that are developed new, and for a variety of reasons. But normally these are still mapped back to the theme. Really, where the questions start is the next couple steps and how we get to corporate value. And that is it can be a challenging process. How I work with organizations on this, and some of the advice that I give, is that the first step is to really identify where you're going. For each of these themes that you've identified, you've identified them because there is in theory some impact or some issue that you're trying to address. If there was no issue or there was no problem, okay, well then why are we wasting our time? So what's the issue you're trying to address? How would you measure that? What's a KPI around that? Because once you've identified, this becomes kind of that success state topic. Now then we can start kind of setting goalposts that connect us between our initiatives and hopefully that issue we've identified. And the reality is that it's never a straight line. There, we kind of go left and we go right. I had someone describe this the other day very well, almost like kind of a boat kind of going in this direction, but maybe they're kind of right and left, kind of right and left. But as long as that kind of the lighthouse is in sight, we kind of know we're going in the right direction. And this is kind of a logic model systems mapping exercise, which we'll get into the details of that here. But identifying those key impacts that each of these themes is trying to address is really important. And I know for Asahi, when thinking about their responsible drinking, they want to understand, okay, well, what are the levers that we can pull in order to actually change outcomes, which is, again, more responsible drinking, which then, well, what does that change? That's health outcomes. And now we start getting into impact KPIs, which we can build a impact model around. The other side, of course, is, then we do want to connect to corporate value in some capacity. What's the business case? We've identified this impact target, the success state. How could it affect the business? And the reality is that this is a hypothetical connection still. We don't, in many cases, have significant data to assess this connection right away. So we have to build a hypothesis. But while building that, we should build a way of testing that. Because as much as I think those in the sustainability space, and myself included, would like to say that we should focus on having more impactful business practices purely for the sake of it, it's not a scalable solution if it isn't going to create some sort of corporate value, because we don't want these to be one-off activities. We want the company to say, okay, how do we do this across our portfolio? Okay, well, we want competitors to look at this and say, great, oh, well, Asahi is adopting more responsible drinking products. Oh, they've got lower alcohol products. Oh, it's affecting their business. Okay, how do we do that? How do we replicate that? And that's how we start seeing market change. So hopefully that gets a little bit more detail here. I definitely understand this is a complicated slide.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Okay, to the point on scale, how do other companies, especially representatives listening in that want to take this back to their companies, how do they do this? Not necessarily this exercise here that you just talked about, but I mean impact weighted accounting as a whole. Where do companies begin?
My thinking about this has actually quite changed a bit over the years. Initially, one of my recommendations was, starting small, doing a quick pilot exercise, and that can be a powerful way of starting. But as I've said multiple times now, and kind of repeating myself, impact accounting is a tool. What's your problems? What are the issues you're facing? In Japan, there's two key themes that kind of come up often in the conversations. One, the kind of the challenge around below one PDRs, which kind of ties to the second point around ineffective telling of your sustainability story. Okay, how can impact weighted accounting answer that question? Can it, first of all? And my belief is that it can. But it's really identifying where is your sustainability efforts struggling at the moment. And even more broadly thinking, what are the key existential strategy questions that you are struggling with? Identifying those and then asking, how can impact address those questions? I think that is a powerful place to start. And it's not necessarily the easiest because it takes some really deep thinking and takes support by some trusted advisors who can understand your business, but also help you kind of think differently. Because I think a lot of organizations have spent so much time thinking about their sustainability work with very little guidance or guidance saying, okay, well, here's your SAS, here, just fill out your SASB disclosures, fill out your GRI disclosures. And now we're in an ecosystem where, if you have a CSRD reporting direct requirement, you need to collect 1,000 plus data points to disclose. That's really taxing. Okay, well, what am I going to do with those data points? And so pausing and stepping back and saying, what's really our objective? That is the first key topic. The second is really saying, okay, how do we start building knowledge and expertise around impact accounting? And understandably, that is one of the more challenging topics. There are, when we think about the environmental side, we have a benefit because a lot of the monetization coefficients can come from science. There are, we know the general monetization approach a little bit better. On the employee side, yeah, there's also some more calculations that have been developed, both the impact weighted accounts, but also now being updated by the IFVI. However, I think where most organizations really want to focus is kind of on their products and services. They really want to develop that material, that connection between what's actually material for the business, which I think is the right approach. The reality, though, is that it is the hardest. And so that's why I tell organizations that want to start with impact weighted accounting, great, but we should need to build to that. And how do we build to that? Identifying what success looks like. Start connecting initiatives to that success state. Because as we start doing that, we start thinking about interim impact KPIs, which often actually become part of the IWA monetization methodology. But we start having a deeper understanding of this impact ecosystem, which is the most important tool. Because once we've done that, I'm not saying the impact weighted accounting becomes easier, but now we know what to do with that. Because the worst case scenario is the organization goes through all the time and effort to do an impact weighted accounting, produces a nice monetization of their impact. Oh, lots of impact, great, discloses it. Investors love it. And then they don't do anything with it. If we don't have some sort of action, some follow-up, okay, this is how we're going to use our findings, I think that is a non-ideal outcome. And of course, all organizations will be at different stages of their journey. And sometimes it will take time to say, okay, what should we do? Maybe we want to disclose and see how people respond. That's fine. But we should have that plan. And so I'm not sure this is a great answer to your question, because I fundamentally have said that the best way to start an impact weighted accounting is to actually think about other things than impact weighted accounting. But that's, I think, the reality. And as someone whose goal is really to think about how we change business decisions within a firm, we have to think about the process, the journey, the objective, and not just skip to that end goal about, okay, well, we want to measure, so we're going to measure.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. If I may ask one more, stepping outside of the business management team and thinking about its relations with external organizations, governing bodies, the consumers, and so forth, what needs to happen for more companies to use impact weighted accounting? How does that interact with the policies that they're responding to or even anticipating, perhaps? And is that the right mindset?
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing more policies being enacted, whether or not it's from kind of an accounting perspective or even local regulations around how organizations manage their impacts on the environment and society. If we take this looking at the kind of disclosure policy space, it becomes tricky to a degree because everyone asks often, okay, well, when will, and if yes, when will impact or impact accounting be something that is we're required to disclose? And it's a good question, to be honest. I think there's a lot of challenging elements around impact accounting that will take a lot of time before it's something that we can mandate in a standardized format, to be completely honest. Having said that, if we look at what is included in the kind of forthcoming ESG disclosures, again, let's take CSRD for an example. You have a variety of metrics, quantitative metrics you have to disclose on, but you also have to disclose on targets, policies, practices, how you're managing certain topics. Or you can say we're not, that's fine, but you have to disclose that. And so I think we will see more disclosures around how organizations are managing their impacts before we see how are you actually monetizing the impacts. And I think that could be a way where organizations can say, okay, well, we don't have to disclose data points yet, so it doesn't mean we don't have to do that much work. I would say no, because the data point is actually the easy part at the end of the day. The hard part is saying, okay, well, actually, how are we collecting data? Okay, how do we actually know this data is correct, regardless of whether or not we're disclosing it? Because management needs to know. How are we reporting it to management? How is management making decisions based off of this data? Because all of this comes together to say, okay, well, do we have targets? Do we have a policy? And so we'll see, I think, something like that emerging in the future. But even here in Japan, the FSA, Financial Services Agency, is recently announced a impact consortium, which is going to be looking at some of these key impact questions. And they are very interested at what impact can mean for Japanese competitiveness going forward. And so there's a lot of interest in the policy space. There's a lot of questions. But those questions will be answered by organizations that are able to build that connection between measuring meaningful contribution to their impact objectives, but also how those impacts create financial value for the firm and put those together. Organizations that can do that, show that, I think, in my opinion, are the ones that are going to effectively write the rules almost that will be driving the disclosures both on kind of international but also national policy level.
Definitely. Thank you for that. This has certainly offered me some insight. I feel like I could ask several more questions, but I should probably turn it over to Sarah. Do you have anything?
Yes, thank you, David, for this. And I learned a lot, and I have so many questions. So let's start with the first one. So the first question is about the actual process, decision-making process of companies deciding to adopt impact-weighted accounts, right? So do you see any patterns? Like, for example, maybe Eisai's case, maybe there is like a strong leader like Yanagi-san, or maybe, Shibusawa-san played a role in this as well. And these things that these actual decision-making process that kind of driving organization towards adopting impact-weighted accounting. And these, if you see any patterns, can they be replicated without having strong leaders like Yanagi-san? Not every organization has someone like him. So how can we replicate that to different organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. Without a doubt, strong leaders play an important role and can really drive this forward. let's say we don't have that. I think one of the themes that I'm seeing is how do we, for example, we have an organization that is perhaps more conservative. And while, okay, management's interested in impact weighted accounting sounds cool, they are hesitant. I don't know, well, let's wait and see, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a very, very energetic, very passionate, very future-looking kind of head of sustainability. How do they drive that conversation? It obviously will vary within every firm, but one of the things that I've seen to be successful is building building cross-department support systems. Again, if you're in the sustainability department, what does this mean to procurement? Have you engaged legal effectively? What does the ops team think about this? I think impact weighted accounting is really no different than other sustainability initiatives where I think a lot of people look at them and say, okay, more work. And that never is a successful outcome because if people view a new initiative, a new task, or a new project, or just a new strategic direction as more work for them, they're very rarely going to voluntarily support this. And so thinking about how can you show that impact accounting or impact, just even impact more broadly, impact thinking, impact strategy thinking, can make other people's lives within your firm better. That is one of the most powerful things. Again, it's not the most easy thing to do, but by building those partnerships and showing that this is not just another investor questionnaire that we've got. This is actually a tool that IR can proactively use to roadshow to investors to say, hey, we know you've been looking for more, you've been asking for higher quality data, but also you've been saying that you want to understand why our sustainability efforts are value creating. Well, here's our analysis. What do you think? Okay, well, maybe you don't agree with every point. That's fine. No one's going to agree 100% with something that you do. But now the conversation's changed from we don't really believe you, this conclusion that you're making about sustainability being value creating, to well, we might disagree with these numbers here and there. Let's talk about them. Very different conversation. Now you've given IR a really powerful tool. Stuff like that, I think, could be really, really powerful in driving this conversation.
Interesting. Thank you. So I have another question. This is related to the discussion we had last week. So we had a contentious point about, so basically it's between automated, basically software solution that provides you sustainability score in 2 minutes or even less. And so, yep. But that has the downside, which is like maybe they use like big data and there's a lot of guesswork. It's not exact. And the credibility and reliability of the data is compromised by using yep. that method. And on the other hand, impact weighted accounts takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and that's not accessible to maybe SMEs if you think about the cost of actual like measuring and using this methodology. And I see that tension, and that was the really heated discussion we had last week. And do you have any thoughts on this?
Absolutely, it's a reality. It is a reality. The reality is specifically, though, more about the fact that some of these automated services, they have their places. They provide quick information, but again, what are you trying to do? If you don't trust the data, if you don't trust the analysis, if you don't understand the analysis, how can you use the output? And again, I think there's many of these kind of automated services that really do great and can be helpful in kind of being directionally guiding and as a quick first start. That's great. But it's all about what's the use case at the end. What are you trying to use this for? Are you just trying to kind of understand sustainability 101? Tell me, what do I need to know? Kind of just help me wrap my head around this concept briefly. That might work. But if we're thinking about, building a strategy that's going to guide your firm and your disclosures for the next 5 years, I think you might be wanting to be a little more confident in the data, understand the analysis. One of my other things I've done in my career, kind of as part of my impact journey, is I was working for one of the leading corporate law firms in New York, helping them build out their sustainability practices and kind of helping integrate impact and how they think about doing legal assessments. And one of the things that I realized is that many organizations don't know, they don't know where their data is coming from, or they're not confident with that. And the amount of times I was sitting in rooms with lawyers, kind of grilling senior execs, being, this is our clients. We're prepping them for questions they might either get from potentially a regulator or investors. Okay, where did you get the data? Do you trust it? What's the analysis? How did you validate it? Key questions that if you don't know are going to look really bad. And the reality is, yeah, it takes more time to understand that, but what are you trying to do with it? And so there is that trade-off. The other thing I do want to mention is that while impact weighted accounting can be a big process, it doesn't have to be. I work with startups who are trying to adopt impact weighted accounting. The difference here is that while maybe large organizations can explore a variety of different topics and go into really, really deep depth because they're trying to understand some of these more strategic and governance questions, that doesn't matter as much for startups in many cases. Startups are very focused. And so what they want to measure, success is very clear. We don't have to worry about identifying success. Well, if we do, that's a bigger problem. But success is normally identified. Really what we're trying to do is, can we quantify that impact so we can show that, hey, there's a tie here between impact and our kind of financial proposition. And by being really focused on that, that actually can be helpful for startups. And so startups can do that actually at pretty low cost. Again, these things take time, but the cost challenge, I think, can be mitigated.
Interesting. Just a follow-up question on that. So the startups that are adopting impact-weighted accounts, are they impact startups that like their mission is to create impact and using impact-weighted accounts to measure that? Or are they more like traditional like tech startups and trying to be more socially conscious and more sustainable startups?
Yeah, in my experience, it's mostly the former, impact-oriented startups working with kind of impact-oriented VCs. And so they're kind of supporting on that front. Having said that, I actually think that there's a big opportunity for just general startups to use impact accounting. And I think one of the big challenges for raising VC capital is that you're fundamentally raising money based off of this vision. And obviously, you're looking a lot at founders' credentials and whatnot, but there's not a lot of data to support an investment decision like there would be in the private equity space. Having a impact vision, expectation, quantification, and showing that this is tied to our business strategy. We're gonna have this much impact. This is how it ties to our key financial indicators. It can be a positive tool for showing that there's market and there's growth opportunities here. Because at the end of the day, we have to remember the goal of businesses is to address a problem in society. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist. Now, we do that in a way that creates profit for shareholders. But if we're not addressing, we're not having some positive impact on an issue, the likelihood that the business will continue is less likely unless there are market considerations keeping the business afloat. But so I think there's a big tie between impact. There's a natural tie between impact and startups, regardless if the startup cares about impact.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you. One last question. So I'm curious. So you mentioned like Eisai or Asahi, and they're like different case studies about impact weighted accounts, like based in Japan. So companies based in Japan using impact weighted accounts, and it's kind of like it's interesting to see that because impact weighted accounts was initiative from the U.S. Harvard Business School, and then I guess Japan is not well known for as a leader of impact measurement or like compared to Europe and America. And like where do you see what kind of trends do you see in Japan and also compared to North America and Europe?
Japan isn't considered an impact leader yet, but that is changing quickly. The work of ASI and other organizations is attracting attention by global organizations. My and this is a little bit of kind of my theory of change, which kind of gets to how the US and Europe are addressing this. If you look at the US, sustainability work is still pushing on, despite the kind of anti-ESG backlash question. The reality is that the political considerations are real. And also at the same time, investors are saying, well, as we talked about earlier, the data showing that a lot of investors are questioning the validity of ESG disclosures and their meaningfulness. That doesn't mean that investors don't care, but they're being more critical. And so in the US, I think companies are still pushing forward on their sustainability work, but being a little quieter about it and maybe taking a little bit longer to they really want to have everything tightly packaged up before they disclose stuff. And so I think we're going to see progress there, but it's going to be a little quieter and a little slower. In Europe, the focus is primarily around complying with regulations. And while the compliance aspect can be important because it's going to elevate the conversation, there's a lot of valuable things that will come out of ESG disclosures in Europe. The flip side is that compliance really rarely leads to innovation. And my concern is that we're going to get too focused on just getting our disclosures in and forget, okay, what's the objective here? Well, the objective is to really effectively measure and manage our positive and negative externalities. Where does that leave Japan? Japan has not been viewed as a sustainability leader, particularly with regards to kind of ESG disclosures, even though that if you look at TCFD disclosures per kind of if I'm from like major stock indices, Japan is either 1 or 2 or something like that, but not viewed really as a sustainability leader, despite the fact that when you look at Japanese companies, there's a deep history between how they interact with society as well as the environment. So I think there's a lot of potential for Japan to really define what effective sustainability business practices look like for Japanese companies. How does that create value for the business, i.e., what's the business case, but also that we're actually creating meaningful sustainability initiatives. It's not massive greenwashing. It's not just kind of pretty sustainability reports. This is real contributions to our local communities or society, both domestically as well as globally. And that's really what I think we need to move towards. So I can actually see Japan becoming an example, both at the company level for how to do this from a practical perspective, but also what does a impact economy look like? And that's, I think, the vision. And I, currently working with many of the leading Japanese companies to develop both their impact strategies as well as prepare for impact weighted accounting. So I think the next year will be very interesting.
I've learned a lot.
My pleasure.
Maddie, over to you.
I did as well, and I am afraid that brings us right to the hour. Thank you, everyone who's tuning in on X and YouTube. Please do not be shy to reach out to either Sarah or me if you have questions, and we can pass them on to David. Thank you, David, for joining us today and sharing all of your knowledge.
Thank
Have
you
a lovely
both.
rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.